Good day and welcome to the introductory training on anthropometric assessment in the 2022 National Dietary Intake Survey. This training is intended for all team members, even if you will not be doing any anthropometric measurements yourself. For those who are interested in learning more, the full content of the anthropometry training can be found in the Hands-on Anthropometry Training Manual, which is available online at the link provided on the slide. This presentation refers to Module 1 in the manual. Let's have a look at what you can expect from this short presentation. We will learn what anthropometry is and why we do anthropometric measurements. We will discuss why it's important to take good quality anthropometric measurements and some steps that we can take to ensure good data quality. And finally, we will talk about which measurements we're taking for the National Dietary Intake Survey 2022 and what equipment will be used. Our first section will provide a brief overview of anthropometry, looking at what it is, why we do it, and how we can ensure that we do it properly. Anthropometry is a science that focuses on measuring the human body and interpreting its size and proportions. Anthropometric assessment can involve many different measurements. In this survey, we are measuring weight, length or height, and various circumferences, specifically the mid-upper arm circumference or MUAC, calf circumference, and waist circumference. There are many reasons to do anthropometric assessment. When we are assessing an individual, anthropometry is an important part of evaluating that person's overall nutrition status, and it helps us to identify undernutrition or overnutrition. Additionally, in infants and young children, anthropometry can also be a good indicator of their overall health. Anthropometry also plays some additional roles in a large-scale survey like this one. Firstly, it allows us to describe the overall anthropometric status of the population. For example, we can see what proportions of people are overweight or underweight. Secondly, we can compare anthropometric assessments to the other parameters we're measuring and see if they are related. For example, we may want to see whether certain food intake patterns are more common in overweight people, or whether household income is related to children's weight. And finally, we can compare the results of our survey to previous and future surveys to see how our population is changing over time. This allows government decision makers to plan appropriate public health programs to address common problems, and also gives us some idea whether existing programs are having any effect. It's important to understand that all anthropometric measurements aren't equally good. Anthropometry looks very easy to do, but it's quite difficult to do it properly. That's why the anthropometrists who will be taking the measurements for this survey have to receive intensive training. If the anthropometric measurements are done poorly, it can affect the results of our study in several ways. Firstly, it will give us an inaccurate picture of our population's nutrition status, and we may be left thinking they are more well-nourished or more malnourished than is really the case. Secondly, inaccurate anthropometric measurements will make it more difficult for us to spot relationships between anthropometry and other parameters such as diet. This may cause us to miss an important relationship or to see a relationship where there isn't really one. In either case, we are left with a wrong picture of how anthropometric measurements and other socio-demographic, dietary or lifestyle factors fit together. And finally, if our measurements are of poor quality, it's difficult to compare them to previous and future studies because the information itself can't be trusted. It's important to remember that the data collected in the National Dietary Intake Survey will inform program priorities and decisions to be made by the National Department of Health. Good quality, accurate data will allow the Department of Health to make the best decisions to improve the health of all South Africans. Fortunately, there are many things we can do to ensure that our measurements are as accurate and as reliable as possible. They can broadly be divided into two categories: equipment-related matters and technique-related matters. Let's look at equipment-related matters first. Our equipment must be of good quality, preferably brand new, and the teams should all use the same make and model of equipment. This limits the variation in measurements due to differences between different pieces of equipment. It's also important to verify the equipment daily. This means checking that the equipment is still measuring accurately by measuring an object of known size or weight. The equipment must be set up and used correctly to ensure accurate measurements, and it's important to take good care of the equipment. For example, if scales are handled roughly, it can damage the spring, which would affect the scale's ability to weigh accurately. All of these factors, taken together, help to ensure that no errors creep in due to our equipment. Next, let's look at the matters relating to measurement technique. Every measurement must be taken according to a strict protocol because even small differences in measurement technique can affect the results. For example, when you're measuring a circumference, moving the measuring tape up or down just 1 centimeter will give you a different reading. We also take every measurement twice to make sure it was correct. The anthropometrists who will be taking the measurements will receive specific training in the exact procedures they should follow when taking measurements. After the training, they will also be assessed to make sure that they're able to take the measurements reliably. No one is allowed to do any anthropometric measurement if they have not completed this training and passed the assessment. Now that we've completed the introduction to anthropometry, let's have a closer look at anthropometric measurements in the National Dietary Intake Survey 2022, including who will be doing the measurements, what we'll be measuring, and what equipment we'll be using. This organogram shows the makeup of the anthropometry team. At the head, there is the anthropometry planning team, who are responsible for developing all the procedures and training manuals and for training the site coordinators to act as lead anthropometrists. Each study site has a site coordinator or lead anthropometrist who oversees the anthropometry field workers for all the teams at their study site. The site coordinators are responsible for training the anthropometry field workers at their sites, for assessing their measurement techniques, and for managing their day-to-day activities. Finally, each fieldwork team will have 2 trained anthropometry field workers, 1 anthropometrist who's responsible for taking the measurements, and 1 assistant who also attends the anthropometry training and is there to assist the anthropometrist with the measurements. Now we will have a brief overview of the measurements we are taking and the equipment we will use. The measurement we're all probably most familiar with is weight. All participants in the survey will be weighed using electronic platform scales. Babies and young children who cannot stand on the scales by themselves will be weighed together with an adult, using the tare function on the scale to subtract the adult's weight. We will also measure length or height in all the participants. We use the term length when we measure the person lying down. This is done for babies and children up to the age of 2 years. A rigid length board, also called an infantometer, is used to measure length. We use the term height when we measure a person standing up. All participants older than 2 years are measured standing up. The equipment we use to measure height is called a stadiometer. Some teams may have the length board and stadiometer combined into one piece of equipment. Here is a picture of such a piece of equipment called a shoreboard. Mid-upper arm circumference, or MUAC, is measured in all participants from the age of 3 months upwards. For children under 5 years old, we use special color-coded MUAC tapes. These tapes have colored areas that show us at a glance when a child's MUAC is too low, so that they can be referred to a clinic for nutrition support. In older children and adults, we use a spring-wound measuring tape to measure MUAC. The spring-wound measuring tape is convenient because once the plastic pin is slid into the base, the tape is pulled taut by pressing a button. If a spring-wound measuring tape is not available, a regular tape measure can also be used. We measure calf circumference only in adults aged 18 years and up. You may not be familiar with calf circumference since it's a relatively new measurement. It is simply a measurement taken around the widest part of the lower leg. We use the same spring wound measuring tape to measure calf circumference that we use for MUAC. Again, if a spring wound measuring tape is not available, a regular tape measure can be used. Finally, we measure waist circumference in secondary school learners and adults. We use the same spring wound measuring tape to measure waist circumference that we used for MUAC and calf circumference. And once again, if a spring wound measuring tape is not available, a regular tape measure can be used. That concludes our brief introduction to anthropometric assessment in the National Dietary Intake Survey 2022. If you have any further questions, you're welcome to contact the site coordinator for your study site. Thank you and go well.